You will never throw away your quilting scraps again after you see this video. My scrap bin is full of gorgeous fabrics that I do not want to throw away, even if the scrap is the tiniest little piece. These are gorgeous fabrics. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to use those leftover fabric scraps to make beautiful and useful items that you will use every day. We are just going to dive right in, grab the fabric, and get sewing. The projects in this video are so fun to make, and they will use up all your leftover binding, your tiny crumb scraps, and more. So let's dive into our scraps and see what we can make today. First up, we are going to make a tissue holder. This is not a plain tissue holder. This is the cutest tissue holder you can make with scraps. Click the link in the description below to download this template or use the measurements 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches. You're also going to need a little piece of ribbon and fabric scraps. We are going to start by picking out 6 different fabrics and giving them a little bit of a press so that they are nice and ready for us to cut with our template. I love having a template for this because you can make sure that your scrap is big enough without having to measure. You can see that I'm lining these layers of fabric up at the top left. That way I can cut these out multiple layers at a time. Once you've cut out all 6 layers, choose 2 for the lining and the backing of your tissue holder, and the other 4 will go on the top of our tissue holder. Now we're going to press 2 of these rectangles lengthwise. So fold them in half, meet the long sides together and press. And then with the other 2, we are going to fold them in half the other way, so crosswise, and press. Now we're going to start assembling the tissue holder. First, take your ribbon and cut about 4 or 5 inches to create a loop. And then we're going to set this aside. We'll slip it in there later. Now grab your 2 unfolded pieces. We're going to decide which is going to be the lining and which will be the back of the tissue holder. So whichever one you want to be the back, lay face up, and then the one you want to be the lining will be face down on the table. So these will be wrong sides together. Now we're going to create kind of a woven stack of the folded pieces around the tissue holder. The folded edges are going to be facing into the middle of the pouch. And at this last one, I'm just picking up that last piece to get, we have an over, under kind of pattern. And in the middle, this will be where the opening is because all those edges come together, they're not going to be sewn. So once you have that little setup, we're just going to make sure all the edges are lined up and go ahead and pin it. When you get to one of the short edges, grab your loop and we're going to put this inside of that little pouch so you see the raw edges coming out. And just pin that in there. This loop is great if you want to attach a keychain, hardware, or a swivel hook to it. So I like to lay the edges flat like that. I'm going to cover it up and just make sure all those edges are right where they should be again. Once you have that nice and pinned, we're going to sew around the entire rectangle with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We don't need to leave an opening on this project because in the center where all the folds meet, we have an opening where we can turn our pouch. Now we are going to clip the corners of this pouch and trim off the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch. And then if you want to, this is an optional step, you can finish the edges of the pouch. I am using pinking shears, which are a zigzaggy scissor that will help from fraying. You can also do a zigzag stitch, use fray check, or just leave it. So now our pouch is coming together. I'm going to turn it right side out just so you can kind of see what it looks like. It is so cute and you can use it like this, but I'm going to show you how to make the edges a little bit boxy. This will help give it that perfect shape for the tissue holder. With the pouch inside out, slip your fingers into that corner in this inside and pinch the corner so you have a little triangle that is perpendicular to the seam allowance. And now I'm just going to put 2 little pins in there to hold that and then sew across that about 1/2 inch from the point of the triangle. And I always like to backstitch at least once, usually twice. And that will give us that really nice little shape. It just gives a little dimension to the pouch. Now trim that seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch and then repeat on the other 3 corners. Now turn your tissue holder right side out and then open up those folds and you can stick a mini travel tissue pack right inside of there. These are perfect for sniffle season. I am going to stash this one in my car. You can also add a keychain and put it on a backpack. These are excellent stocking stuffers and great gifts for friends. Next, I have a project for you to use up all your leftover binding strips. I have a bin that I put all my extra binding strips in. I always use the same width, 2.5 inches. So these are already cut and ready for me to use for a project. You can also cut your own strips for this project or use a jelly roll, which comes with pre-cut 2.5-inch strips. I am just going to take these to the sewing machine and start sewing. I'm not going to plan it out too much. We are going to sew these together and create a gorgeous striped placemat. So I am making sure the strips are at least 13 inches long and then sewing them together. For this project, I prefer to just start sewing and make sure that they're longer than 13 inches. You can cut them 13 inches first before sewing together, but I like to have it a little extra on there. I feel like it gives me a nicer edge and a nicer finish, and we'll trim it down later. So I am just chain piecing these strips together, making sure before I sew them that they are 13 inches long. Once you have sewn 4 sets together, grab another strip and add it to one of your sets of 2. We need a total of 9 strips for this project. Once you have 3 sets of 2 and 1 set of 3, we're going to sew all 4 of these sets together. I like to make sure the top edge is mostly lined up, and that's where I'm going to sew them together. And we are just going to keep doing that until we have a panel of 9 strips that are more than 13 inches long. Once that is done, bring it over to your pressing mat. We're going to press all the seam allowances in the same direction. I'm pressing mine all to the right side. Once you have a nice flat panel, bring it over to your cutting space. We're going to trim up the top of the placemat, and then we're going to cut this down to 13 inches, and then it should be about 18.5 inches wide. If it's a little bit off, that's okay, but we'd want to just trim up all the edges so that it's nice and squared off. And then if your fabric on the short edges has skewed, you're also going to want to just trim that down. Make sure you have a nice flat straight edge. Now our panel is ready to be made into a placemat, so grab a piece of quilt batting. And then we're going to lay our panel on that batting and baste it with a spray baste. This is a sticky adhesive. I am interrupting your tutorial to tell you that on Monday, November 11th, I will be sewing right here on YouTube live. There will be giveaways, and I'm also going to tell you about a big project that I can't wait to share with you. So I hope you'll join me Monday, November 11th. The link to the event is in the description below. That is a temporary bond that will allow us to top stitch these pieces together. I like to start in the middle and kind of work my way out, pressing really gently. And then peel up the other side and stick that on. Now grab a piece of backing fabric. You can either use yardage or another large scrap, or you can do another panel and back it with a second panel of strips. I'm using just this big piece of fabric, so I am going to put that face down on my table and then put my batting and panel face up, and then just spray baste that together as well. Once you've done that, pat it down, and now we're going to let this sit for a couple minutes, maybe 10 or 20 minutes. We just want that spray base to set and not be tacky. Now we're going to top stitch along these strips right where the seam allowance is. So I pressed it to one side, and I'm going to sew on top of the side with the seam allowance under it. This will give it a nice sturdy finish, and it is just going to be gorgeous with those stitching lines. Keep top stitching until you've finished all the lines. I am just doing one line on each strip, but you can do on either side of the seam if you want. Now our panel is finished and ready to be turned into a placemat, so I am just going to trim off all the excess backing and batting, making sure I'm squaring that up again. We still want it to be about 13 inches by 18.5. But if you find you need to make it 12.5 inches by 18, that's fine. This is still going to be a good size placemat. Now grab some more 2.5-inch strips. We're going to bind this just like we would bind a quilt. I found extra strips in my bin, so I'm going to use these to bind it. They're different colors and I love that scrappy different look, so I'm going to use a pink and a purple. I'm going to put them together. So to join binding strips, put the edges together like this, and then we're going to sew across that diagonal. I like to use a fabric marker to draw a line across that diagonal and then pin it in place so I don't lose the placement. After you've sewn that, trimmed off the excess fabric, leaving about 1/4 inch as a seam allowance, and then go ahead and press that seam allowance open and then press your binding in half. Now we're going to sew this on just like we would a quilt binding. So if you have never done this before, just pick a spot, any spot, leave about 5 or 7 inches of binding on one edge, and we're going to start pinning this. Start sewing it on with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you are going to sew all the way into the corner until you're 3/8 inch from the edge. So you can either mark a little dot or just eye it. And then you'll pull your project out and fold the binding over like this. So you're going to make a triangle and a square, and then line it up again with the edge, and then just start sewing right at the top 3/8 inch from that side edge. Once you get close to where you started, you're going to leave probably about 5 to 7 inches, and then we're going to grab our binding strips. We want to make these overlap exactly the width of the binding strip. So my binding strip is 2.5 inches, so I want these to overlap 2.5 inches. Now we're going to sew these two edges together the same way we did when we were sewing the binding strips together. So we are going to put the two edges together and sew along the diagonal. This gets a little tricky because it's tight in there, so if you need to undo some of your stitches, that's totally fine. Once you have that sewn, you can trim off the excess fabric, press that open, and press your binding down again. Now just finish sewing that binding on using the same seam allowance. Once the binding is sewn onto the front, you can flip it over to the back and use a hand needle and thread and attach it to the back with a slip stitch. When you get to the corner, you are just going to fold that into a little triangle. I like to use my needle to kind of push the fabric down to create that angle, and then continue attaching that binding. Once you're done, tie it off and your placemat is all done. This project is also reversible, so make sure you pick something gorgeous for the back. The next project is this cute hoop ornament. This can be used as wall decor for your sewing room, or tie a string on top, and we're going to put this on our Christmas tree. This project uses what some quilters call crumb scraps, or pieces smaller than 1 inch. There is a free template on my website. Click the link in the description below to get this. And this is designed for a 4-inch mini embroidery hoop. You'll also need string if you plan to hang this, interfacing, and heat and bond. So grab some tiny scraps. We're going to start by backing a scrap with heat and bond. Make sure you have the sticky side down on your fabric when you are pressing it. Once it's cool, peel off the backing and you will see the heat and bond right on that fabric. And now we're going to use the templates to cut out the pieces of the quilt block. So you're going to cut 8 triangles with one fabric and 1 center square with another fabric. Once you've done that, we are going to cut out a circle of fabric and back it with interfacing. The template will be the right size for this. And then I like to use the template to find my placement. So we want this centered in the middle of the circle. So find that placement and then press it to adhere the heat and bond to that circle. And now we're going to add the little triangles. This is a sawtooth block, so I'm just putting the triangles on each side just like this, and then I'm going to press them again to hold. Once you are done with that, you can give it a final press, and then if you want to, you can just go ahead and put this in your hoop, or you can give it some top stitching. I love the top stitching just because I love the stitchy look. So it gets a little tricky, but you can do about 1/8 of an inch all around each of those little pieces. Now we're going to open up our embroidery hoop and put this in. This will be like our little frame. So grab the inner circle and center your fabric on it. And then we're just going to put that top circle right on top and push it down. Tighten that up and then trim off the extra fabric around the back. Now if you want to hang this up on a tree, you can grab some baker's twine and just tie that around the metal hardware at the top. These are perfect for any quilter in your life. Thanks for watching. For more scrap sewing ideas, click the video above.